Keanu Reeves just asked Elon Musk about God. His response left the church in silence. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Now let's begin. The glow of candlelight flickered along the stone walls of the old church in Los Angeles, casting long shadows beneath stained glass windows that hadn't seen this much attention in decades. It was a night called Evening of Meaning, where artists, scientists, spiritual leaders, and thinkers gathered, not for spectacle but for silence, soul, and truth. Keanu Reeves sat near the back, blending into the dim light like a man who had learned how to disappear when he wanted to. His black jacket hung loosely over his frame, his hands folded quietly in his lap. His eyes were calm, but behind them was something more, something searching. The kind of look people have when they carry stories they don't talk about. Up front, under the arched beams of the vaulted ceiling, Elon Musk sat beside a rabbi, a monk, and a poet. The pews were filled with the kind of people whose names made headlines. But tonight, there were no flashing cameras. No paparazzi, just questions. Keanu hadn't planned to speak. He didn't come to be seen. He came because a priest he trusted had once told him that meaning comes not from answers, but from honest questions. And tonight, something in the air felt different. He watched Elon closely. The way he shifted when the monk spoke about surrender. The way his eyes narrowed slightly when the rabbi told a story of doubt. Elon's face was still, but there were cracks forming in the armor of logic. Keanu recognized it, the same way someone who's known grief can spot it in someone else. There was a microphone passed along for closing reflections. Each person who took it offered soft thoughts about purpose, the stars, the ache of wanting more. Then the host stood. If anyone has a final question, he said, "We'll take just one more." Keanu didn't move at first, but then his hand rose, slowly, deliberately, and in that one movement, heads turned. A few gasps. One woman put a hand to her chest. He stood up, took the mic gently, and looked toward Elon. His voice was steady, low, almost like a whisper meant only for one man. "Elon," he said, pausing just long enough for silence to settle thick in the church. "Do you ever think about God? Not in theory, but in your quietest moments?" The air went still. Even the candles seemed to stop flickering. It wasn't the first time Keanu had stepped into this church. Years ago, before the world learned to admire his stillness, before he became Hollywood's quiet heart, he had sat in one of these pews, knees trembling, heart shattered. It was after the loss of someone he didn't have the words to grieve out loud. The priest who found him that night didn't offer sermons or salvation, just presence, a warm silence, an understanding hand on his shoulder. That priest, now older and slower, had reached out 2 weeks ago. "We're hosting a night of reflection," he'd said. "Not religion, not rules, just space for wonder. Come if your heart needs quiet." Keanu hadn't hesitated. Elon Musk had come for different reasons. Not spiritual ones, not at first. He'd been invited as a modern mind, a label he found both amusing and exhausting. Still, curiosity was his compass. The structure of ancient buildings fascinated him, as did the architecture of belief. And he'd recently begun rereading myths, not for faith but for insight, for pattern, for meaning. They had never shared a stage, let alone a conversation. But Keanu had watched Elon from a distance, watched him in interviews, in debates, in TED Talks where he spoke of colonizing Mars and implanting chips in brains. What struck Keanu wasn't Elon's intelligence. That was obvious. It was his comfort with the unknown. What kind of man, Keanu often wondered, stares into the infinite void and doesn't blink? The question had lived inside him for years. And tonight, it tugged at him like a child pulling at a sleeve. Keanu shifted in the pew. The soft voice of a poet drifted through the chapel, talking about the soul like it was a violin string waiting to be played. But Keanu wasn't hearing her. He was watching Elon, watching how his fingers tapped gently on the wood armrest, how his eyes darted, not in arrogance, but in calculation. He's thinking, Keanu thought, but what is he feeling? He looked down at his hands. They trembled just slightly. He wasn't nervous to speak. He was nervous to expose something, to ask a question that might be dismissed or misunderstood. But something deeper inside him, older than logic, kept whispering, "Now. Ask it now." He breathed in slowly. And then the moment came. The microphone rested lightly in Keanu's hand, as if even it sensed the weight of what had just been spoken. His words didn't echo, but they reverberated, not off the stone walls, but in the quietest places of the people listening. "Elon, do you ever think about God? Not in theory, but in your quietest moments." There was no reaction at first, just a long, breathless silence. The moderator blinked, then glanced at Elon with the uncertain smile of someone unsure if they should step in or step back. But no one moved, not even the air. Elon didn't answer right away. His face didn't betray much. Not confusion, not offense, just a sudden, curious stillness. Like something had tapped the center of his chest. Not hard, just enough to make him pause. He slowly leaned forward, fingers lacing together on his knee. He started, then stopped. That in itself was rare. He exhaled and looked slightly to the left, as though searching through memory instead of intellect. "When I was 9, he said finally, we lived in Pretoria. There wasn't much light pollution there. On clear nights, I'd sneak out onto the roof and just lie on the metal tiles, looking up. The room hung on each word. I remember one night in particular, stars so clear they looked like they were breathing. I didn't know what I was staring into, just space. But I kept thinking." He paused again, this time not for effect, but because something caught in his throat. "If I yell loud enough, will anything hear me?" He looked up briefly, not at Keanu, but at the high domed ceiling of the church, where painted angels floated among faded clouds. "I wasn't asking for anything," he continued. "I wasn't hoping for miracles. I just wanted to know if I was alone in it." It was the way he said alone that silenced even the fidgeting hands in the pews. It didn't sound like loneliness. It sounded like existence hanging by a thread. He smiled faintly. I never got an answer. But that night, something strange happened. I fell asleep on the roof. And when I woke up, I felt not watched, not protected, just held, like the sky had arms. I never told anyone that before. He let out a short breath. "I'm not saying it was God. I'm not saying it wasn't. But sometimes silence isn't absence. It's invitation." A murmur rippled quietly, not of voices, but of hearts moving all at once. Keanu, still standing, nodded once, eyes locked with Elon's, not in agreement but in recognition. Two men from different worlds sharing one fragile question. And in that ancient, time-worn church, surrounded by thinkers, actors, critics, and seekers, not a soul moved, not a throat cleared. Not even a breath dared disturb the moment. Because Elon hadn't said the word God. But somehow, he didn't need to. The next morning, the world was already awake. Someone in the audience had recorded the exchange on their phone. Grainy from the side aisle, but unmistakably clear. Keanu's question, Elon's pause, the vulnerable story about the sky and the feeling of being held. It was raw. It was rare. And it spread like wildfire. Within hours, the moment was chopped into reels, layered with ambient music, stitched with soft fades and glowing subtitles. On TikTok, it was titled, "What Elon Musk Said About God." No one expected this. On YouTube, the thumbnail screamed, "Church fell silent after this." On Twitter, threads bloomed with debates, conspiracy theories, heartfelt reflections, and religious breakdowns of every syllable. One tweet went viral. "Elon Musk doesn't say the word God, and yet this is the most spiritual thing I've ever heard." Another one followed. "Keanu just made Elon human." News outlets jumped in, eager to spin their angles. Keanu sparks unexpected theological confession from Elon Musk. A tech titan talks faith. Was Musk hinting at belief? Elon Musk and the night the church held its breath. But not everyone was gentle. Some voices mocked the moment. He didn't say anything. It's just vague philosophy. Of course they'll use a celebrity to smuggle religion into tech spaces. Keanu's playing the spiritual monk again. Convenient branding. And then there were the ones who took sides. Evangelical influencers declared it a breakthrough. Atheist bloggers dismissed it as performance. Psychologists dissected it. Pastors reposted it. Youth groups quoted it. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves shut his phone off. He hadn't asked that question to trend. He hadn't come to create a moment. For him, it wasn't a moment. It was a whisper, a personal ache disguised as curiosity. Now it was trending. He retreated into silence, not out of shame, but reverence. The church had been a sanctuary that night, and it had been breached, not by malice, but by momentum. And now the internet had taken something intimate and turned it into a spectacle. One evening, days later, his phone buzzed. A single text. Elon. Didn't expect that. Keanu stared at the screen. He thought about replying something clever, something self-aware. Instead, he typed, "Neither did I, but maybe someone out there needed it." There was no reply, but that was okay. Not everything needed one. Some questions weren't meant to be answered, just shared. Days after the storm of headlines had begun to fade, Keanu found himself standing once again at the threshold of the church, this time alone. The heavy wooden doors creaked softly as he pushed them open, and the echo of his footsteps filled the stillness. There were no speakers tonight, no audience, no carefully curated lighting, just dust-catching shafts of sunlight and the scent of old wood and wax. He moved slowly toward the candle altar, his hands in the pockets of his coat, his shoulders a little heavier than usual. He reached into the small brass bowl for a match and lit a single white candle, placing it gently in the farthest corner, away from the cluster. He didn't speak. He never did during this ritual. The candle was for someone he loved and lost long ago. And for years now, he lit one whenever life grew too loud. He sat on the cold wooden pew and closed his eyes. Elon's words echoed in his mind again. Not the exact phrasing, but the feeling. That strange, haunting phrase, "Silence isn't absence. It's invitation." Keanu let out a slow breath. That line hadn't left him. But now, with the internet having twisted something sacred into viral content, he wasn't sure anymore. He wondered if the question he asked had done more harm than good, had helped anyone, or had it just added to the noise. He had tried so hard to live without spectacle, to make his moments private, real, quiet. And now the quietest question he'd ever asked had been turned into thumbnails and think pieces. He felt exposed. Not mocked, not criticized. He could handle those things. But exposed. Like someone had taken his inner life and held it under a fluorescent light for the world to dissect. Maybe he shouldn't have said anything. Maybe the question was meant to stay inside. He looked at the candle again. Its flame flickered just slightly. It wasn't grand. It didn't roar or demand attention. It just existed. Small, steady, like truth, he thought, or faith. Still, a part of him wasn't sure. Doubt crept in like a draft through the stained glass cracks. What if words weren't meant to be said out loud? What if wonder only survives in silence? He stayed there a while longer, not searching for answers, but hoping the questions would quiet down. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed softly through the empty church aisle. Keanu didn't look up. He knew that rhythm. He'd heard it before, years ago, when he first came here broken, barely speaking. Father Callahan. The priest sat beside him without a word, letting the silence breathe between them like an old friend. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, in his calm, gravel-touched voice, the priest said, "I watched the clip." Keanu's jaw tensed. It wasn't supposed to be a clip. "I know," Callahan nodded. "It was a moment, and it was yours." Keanu looked toward the candle, still burning in the corner. "I keep thinking maybe I shouldn't have said anything," he murmured. "Maybe I made it worse." Callahan turned to him. "Do you really think that?" Keanu hesitated. "I don't know. The world doesn't treat sincerity like it used to. It spins it, drowns it, turns everything into something to sell or argue about." The priest smiled gently, and yet people listened, even the ones who argued. That question stirred something, not because it was about God, but because it was real. Keanu looked down at his hands. "You didn't ask the question for yourself, Keanu," the priest continued. "You asked it for all the people who are afraid to." The words landed with the weight of truth, not heavy, but grounding. That was it. That was what had been haunting him. It was never about the answer. It was about permission. Permission to wonder. To ask in a world that punishes vulnerability and prizes certainty. He felt something ease in his chest. A a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A few nights later, he met Elon at a quiet rooftop restaurant in the hills, away from cameras, away from anyone who might recognize them. They didn't talk about theology, or God, or the church. They talked about stars, black holes, dreams they had as kids, the feeling of not fitting in, the strange ache of living in a world too loud for questions and too hungry for certainty. At one point, Elon laughed softly and said, "You know, I still don't believe in anything, but I think I understand why people want to." Keanu just smiled. You don't have to believe in something to be moved by it. And for both of them, for that night, that was enough. The church was quiet again. Days had passed, the world had moved on, and the viral storm had faded into a soft hum in the background. Yet the silence inside these walls remained exactly as Keanu remembered it. Steady, sacred, untouched. He walked down the center aisle slowly, the same path he'd taken so many times before, but tonight his steps felt lighter. There was no weight of sorrow, no fear of exposure, just presence. At the candle altar, he paused. His fingers reached for a match, and he lit a single flame, not in memory of loss, but in recognition of something else. Not the dead, but the living, the searchers, the doubters, the people who felt small under the sky, but still chose to look up. He placed the candle gently among the others. Its glow flickered, dancing softly in the stillness. And then, with no one watching, with no performance, no platform, and no applause, Keanu whispered, as if to the air itself, "Maybe belief isn't about certainty. Maybe it's just about asking, even when you don't expect a reply." The words weren't meant to answer anything. They weren't even meant to be remembered. They were just meant to be said. He stood there for a moment longer, watching the candle flicker, one tiny flame against the vast dark, doing nothing more than existing. But somehow, that was everything. As the screen fades, the voice returns one last time, softer than before. Sometimes, the quietest questions echo the loudest truths.